I always thought my days would end in silence, warm coffee and television on without sound. At 72, I learned not to expect surprises. My routine was predictable, almost invisible, as if the world had forgotten that I still existed. I woke up early, watered the plants and sat on the porch watching the street go by. Nothing ever changed, until that phone rang. The sound of the phone echoed through the house like a strange, misplaced warning. I looked at the device suspiciously, feeling a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain. No one used to call me at that time. I thought it was a deception or some insistent propaganda. Still, I answered, not imagining that my life was about to fall apart. On the other end of the line, a formal voice introduced herself as an employee of the registry office. She pronounced my full name with a cold precision, as if she were reading a file. He said he needed to confirm data on a recent record made in my name. That word, record, made my hands start sweating. I hadn't been to any notary's office lately. When she mentioned the total transfer of my possessions, I felt the ground disappear under my feet. I asked if there was any mistake. I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the weight of it all. My goods? My house? My whole life summed up in a phrase said so naturally? The employee only repeated the information, politely and at a distance. I was mute for a few seconds, holding the phone tightly, as if it was going to fall out of my hand. My head was spinning, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. She explained that I had signed a document days before, validated and legally registered. A simple document, it was said. For me, that was impossible. I thanked him and hung up without knowing exactly what he said. The silence that remained afterwards was deafening. I looked around and everything looked the same. The furniture, the old photos, the clock on the wall, but I knew something had changed forever. The house that had always been my refuge now seemed fragile, as if it was no longer mine. I sat slowly on the couch, feeling my heart beating too hard for my tired body. I tried to remember any paper I had recently signed. It was then that my daughter's face appeared in my mind, accompanied by a hurried smile. She had been there a few days before, sitting at exactly that same table. At that moment, I felt a mixture of fear and shame. Fear of losing everything, shame for maybe having been too naive. I, who had spent my whole life taking care of everyone, now seemed unable to take care of myself. Loneliness has become heavier than ever. I got up with difficulty and walked to the kitchen table. I ran my hand over the time-scarred wood, remembering how many important decisions had already been made there. I never imagined that the most dangerous of them had happened without me noticing. A simple scribble could have destroyed decades of effort. At that moment, I understood that this call was not just a bureaucratic warning. It was the beginning of a silent war, fought within my own family. And for the first time, I felt like I was completely alone against someone who knew me better than anyone. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel. Here you will find real, intense stories full of twists and turns that show how the truth always comes out, even when the betrayal comes from those we least expect. I closed my eyes and let the memory take me back to that day. My daughter arrived early, saying she was in a hurry, but she brought a cake and a rehearsed smile. He said he wanted to solve a few simple things to make life easier in the future. He spoke fast, as if he didn't want to give space for questions. I trusted, as I always have. She spread some papers on the kitchen table, right where I was now. He said they were common documents, bank things, organizational things. He used difficult words, mixed with affection and impatience. I felt small, outdated, unable to understand that modern world, and that silenced me. I remember asking if I needed to read everything. She sighed deeply, rolled her eyes discreetly, and said there was no need. "It's all standard, Mom," she assured, touching my hand. That phrase was said so naturally that it made me feel foolish for being suspicious. I didn't want to be a burden. I signed where she pointed out, once, twice, 3 times. My handwriting was no longer so firm, but it still carried my name with dignity. While I signed, she talked about her grandchildren, about work, about the future. Not a word about losing my home, my security, my autonomy, nothing that sounded like danger. After he finished, he quickly collected the papers and gave me a kiss on the cheek. He said that everything was resolved and that I didn't have to worry about anything. I had a strange feeling in my chest, but I swallowed the discomfort. After all, she was my daughter. Who else could wish me well? Now, looking at that same table, everything seemed too clear. The tone of urgency, the haste, the way she avoided my questions. The signs were there, wide open, and I didn't want to see it. Maybe out of love, maybe for fear of being alone. Perhaps because mothers learn early to blame themselves. I got up again and started rummaging through old drawers, looking for any copy, any clue. My hands trembled as I fiddled with envelopes yellowed by time. Each roll seemed to carry a new weight, a hidden threat. The feeling of betrayal began to creep in slowly, like poison. The most painful thing was not the possibility of losing my possessions. It was realizing that someone I trusted blindly could have planned it. The idea hurt me more than any material injustice. I felt used, disposable, as if my only function had been to sign and get out of the way. I sat down again, feeling my eyes burn, but not letting the tears fall. Something inside me was beginning to change, even though I couldn't explain it. Naivety gave way to distrust. Unconditional love was beginning to crack. For the first time, I thought that maybe I needed to fight. As the day progressed slowly, I knew that this signature had not been a simple mistake. There was intention, there was calculation, there was silence. And at that moment, I promised myself that I would not stand by and wait for everything to be taken away from me. Even though I was frail, even though I was old, I was still alive. When my daughter returned to my house, 2 days after the call from the registry office, I still tried to believe that it was all just a misunderstanding. I opened the door with a heavy heart, looking in her face for any sign of concern. But what I found was haste and impatience. She entered without asking permission, as if that space no longer belonged to me. It was there that I felt something break between us. I told him about the call carefully, choosing each word so as not to sound accusatory. She said she was confused and scared. He expected consolation, perhaps an apology. Instead, she crossed her arms and let out a heavy sigh. He said that I was exaggerating, that it was all for my own good. I asked why I hadn't been clearly warned. She replied that I wouldn't really understand, that these things were complicated for someone my age. Each sentence was said with a tone of superiority that made me cringe inside. I never thought I'd hear my own daughter treat me like a burden. The humiliation came quietly but deeply. When I insisted on knowing exactly what I had signed, she looked away. She said she didn't remember the details, that I should trust her. That word, trust, sounded almost like a provocation. The same confidence that put me in that situation was now used to shut me up. I felt a timid anger born, mixed with sadness. She began to walk around the house, observing everything with an evaluative eye. He commented that maintenance was expensive, that perhaps it would be better to sell while the market was good. He spoke as if I were not there, as if the house was just an asset, not the scene of my entire life. Her every step echoed like a threat. I tried to remember who I was before that moment. I had already raised children, supported a house, faced losses. Still, there, in front of her, I felt small. She spoke and I listened, as if my voice had lost value. It was a cruel role reversal. When she said that it might be better to talk to a lawyer, her face changed completely. The sweetness disappeared, giving way to a hard and calculating look. She accused me of ingratitude, said I was being manipulated by third parties. For the first time, I felt afraid of my own daughter. She left slamming the door, leaving behind a heavy silence. I stood in the middle of the room, trying to understand how we got to that point. The love that had always guided me now seemed to have been used against me. The woman I created was no longer there. I sat in the armchair and cried in silence, ashamed of the tears. It was not just a question of goods, it was a deep rupture. I was being pushed out of life itself, and at that moment, I realized that I needed to stop pretending that everything would be okay on its own. That conversation made it clear that there was no more room for naivety. Something inside me began to harden, even though I didn't know how to react yet. I was being underestimated, discarded, silenced. But I still breathed, I still thought, I still felt. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the dark ceiling for hours. The doubt that haunted me was no longer whether there was betrayal. The question now was how far she was willing to go, and what would happen to me if I didn't react in time. In the following days, I began to observe every detail more closely. The house, which had always been my shelter, began to feel unstable. Every creak of the floor sounded like a warning. I walked through the rooms with the feeling that I could be expelled at any moment. It was like living in threatened territory. My daughter started to call frequently, always with the same speech. She said that I needed to think about the future, that living alone was dangerous. He insinuated that I could have an accident, forget about the gas on, get lost on the street. Each sentence was an attempt to paint me as incapable, and I felt my ground disappear little by little. She mentioned, more than once, the possibility of me moving in with her. The tone was not one of invitation, but of decision. He spoke of selling the house to avoid problems. That house where I buried my husband, raised my children and survived life. For her, it was just an asset. For me, it was everything. I began to fear that she would take action without telling me. I started to store important documents in a hidden folder. She slept badly, waking up frightened by any noise. The feeling of insecurity settled like a constant shadow. I no longer felt protected even inside my own home. Neighbors began to look differently, influenced by her comments. One day, I heard someone ask if I was okay in my head. That hurt more than any material threat. My reputation, built on years of respect, was being called into question. It was all part of the same plan. I felt ashamed to ask for help, but fear spoke louder. I didn't want to be hospitalized, removed, silenced for good. I knew that if I lost my autonomy, I would lose any chance to fight. The house represented more than walls, it was my last defense. I began to understand that this situation was not just a family conflict. It was a power struggle, and I was on the weaker side, at least in their eyes. The image of a confused old woman seemed too convenient for those who wanted to make decisions in my place. Still, something inside me refused to accept that fate. Each veiled threat aroused a silent resistance. I might have been scared, but I wasn't defeated. Fear began to share space with the need to act. I spent hours reviewing old photos, touching objects that told my story. It reminded me of who I was before I was reduced to a problem. I had not come there to disappear without a fight. This awareness began to strengthen me. That week, I realized that I needed help outside of the family. Someone who was not emotionally involved. Someone who saw what was happening clearly. The idea still scared me, but it no longer seemed impossible. It was there, in the midst of fear and uncertainty, that something new was born in me. A silent decision, still fragile, but firm. I wouldn't give up my life so easily. And that house, my history, my dignity, would not be taken without resistance. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling that there was something hidden inside my own house. It was not a noise, nor a presence. It was a premonition, as if the walls held a truth that I still didn't have the courage to face. I made coffee, but the taste was bitter in my mouth. I knew that if I didn't look for answers, I would be swallowed up by that doubt. I opened the drawer where I had kept papers for years, the same one I almost never touched. Yellowed envelopes, old bills, birthday cards, receipts that I didn't even remember why I kept them. It all seemed insignificant, until I noticed that some folders were out of place. I'm simple, but I'm organized. That mess wasn't mine. I sat at the table and started to separate everything by dates, as I did when my husband was still alive and we planned expenses. Each document was a small piece of memory, and with each leaf turned, I felt my heart beating faster. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I would find it. At the bottom of a blue folder, I found copies of the deed, policies, and an old proof of insurance. There was also an old power of attorney, from years ago, that I did not remember signing. My hand went straight to the signature, as if I were searching for my own identity on paper. It was my name, but it didn't seem like my gesture. That gave me goosebumps. I continued digging and found notes on a loose sheet, written in handwriting that I recognized at the time, my daughter's. It wasn't a letter, it was a list. Dates, numbers, names of notary offices and a circled word, transfer. I swallowed, feeling the blood drain from my face. It was not improvisation, it was planning. The shock was so great that I had to lean on the chair. The image of her saying, "It's just a formality, Mom," came back like a slap. I realized that it didn't start last week. That had been built for a long time, calmly, patiently. Like I was a project, not a mother. Moving a little more, I found copies of correspondence from the bank that I had never seen. The address was mine, but the contact person was her. My name was there, but life seemed to have been diverted into her hands. I felt such a deep humiliation that my tears fell without asking permission. It was as if my voice had been stolen in writing. I got up and went to the closet where I kept a box with my husband's things. Photographs, his wedding ring, old notes, little treasures that reminded me that I was once truly loved. When I opened the box, a folded paper fell to the floor. It was a receipt from decades ago, with a handwritten note, signed by him. Something I had never read carefully. The receipt referred to a purchase that I always thought was simple, but there was a different detail there. A name that I did not recognize, linked to the house's documentation. My stomach turned. It was a loose, old thread that didn't match the story I knew. And suddenly, I understood that there was a past buried underneath everything. At that moment, I felt that it wasn't just my daughter who was hiding things. It was as if my entire family had lived with pieces of truth missing. I stared at the roll as if staring at a locked door. If I opened it, I might not be able to go back to being the same, but I no longer had the luxury of closing my eyes. I put it all away in a new briefcase, neatly attached, and hid it where I knew she wouldn't look. My hand trembled, but my mind was strangely clear. I was no longer just a confused lady who signed without reading. I was someone who had evidence in my hands, and I was ready to dig deeper, whatever the cost. At the end of that afternoon, I went out to the balcony trying to breathe a little. The air was cold, and the leaves of the trees made a soft sound, as if the world insisted on being normal. But I felt different, as if I were carrying a heavy secret in my arms. It was then that I saw Mrs. Marjorie crossing the sidewalk with firm steps. My neighbor of years, too attentive not to notice my face. She stopped at the gate and looked at me in a way that left me defenseless. It wasn't a curious look, it was a worried look, of someone who has seen too many things in life. He asked if I was okay, and the way he said my name made me want to collapse. I tried to smile, to say that it was just tiredness, but my voice cracked mid-sentence. Marjorie walked in unceremoniously, like someone who knows when not to ask permission. He sat with me and was silent for a few seconds, respecting my time. Then I said something that struck me like lightning, that my daughter was walking strangely. He said he saw her talking to a man in a car, looking at my house as if measuring the walls. And that he heard the word, sale. I felt my heart tighten, but at the same time, something in me felt relieved. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't crazy. There were signs outside my head, in the real world. I told her about the call from the registry office, and her face closed right away. She asked me if I had signed anything recently. When I confirmed, she let out an "I knew it," softly, as if she was already expecting it. He said that he has seen this kind of thing happen to elderly people in the neighborhood. Children who use love as a key, trust as a weapon. And then she held my hand tightly, like someone holding someone on the edge of an abyss. I began to cry, not from weakness, but from exhaustion. Marjorie didn't try to shut me up, she didn't say it was going to be okay. She just stood there, firm, letting me feel it. When I was able to breathe, she spoke in a direct, almost harsh way. I needed professional help. A lawyer. Someone who was not impressed by tears and manipulation. I hesitated, because asking for a lawyer seemed to declare war. And I still had that instinct inside me to protect my daughter, even though she was destroying me. Marjorie noticed my conflict and went deeper. He said that love is not accepting abuse. He said that mother is not synonymous with target, and that, if I didn't act, I would lose not only my home, but my own freedom. She said that an acquaintance of hers, a respected lawyer, has already helped a lady they tried to unjustly interdict. The word interdict chilled me inside. I imagined someone signing for me, deciding where I would live, what I would do, as if I were a child. The image terrified me, and for the first time, I felt enough anger to push the fear aside. Marjorie took a piece of paper and wrote a phone number in large handwriting. He told me to call the next day, early, before my daughter knew. He told me to separate documents and write down everything I remembered. His voice had the firmness of someone who is not asking, he is saving. I kept that paper as if it were a survival note. When she left, the house seemed less cold. Not because the problem had disappeared, but because I was no longer completely alone. I looked at the kitchen table, at the hidden briefcase, at the phone that haunted me, and I felt a strange spark in my chest, small but alive. The feeling that I could still turn the tide. That night, I slept little, but not out of desperation. I slept little because my head worked like never before, planning, remembering, connecting dots. For the first time in a long time, I didn't see myself as someone waiting for the end. I saw myself as someone about to start a fight, and I knew that at dawn, I would take the next step. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, with my heart racing and my head heavy. The paper with the lawyer's number was folded inside my bag, as if I could escape. I spent a few minutes looking at the phone, rehearsing what I would say. Asking for help has always been difficult for me, but losing everything in silence would be worse. When I finally called, my voice came out low, almost unsure. I explained the situation the way I could, stumbling over the words, afraid of sounding confused. On the other end of the line, he listened in silence, without interrupting me. That calm attention brought me unexpected relief. For the first time, I felt that someone was taking my story seriously. He asked me to come to the office that same afternoon, taking all the documents I had. He said that time was important. That sentence made me understand the gravity of the situation once and for all. It was not just any family drama. It was something that could cost me my freedom. The office was in the center of the city, in an old, solid building, as if it had seen many battles before mine. My legs trembled as I waited to be called. I watched people passing by, briefcases in hand, lives being decided in closed rooms. I wondered if I had the strength for that. I wondered if it was still time. When I entered, he looked me in the eye before looking at any paper. He asked me to take a deep breath and start from the beginning. I told everything, from the call from the registry office to the conversation with my daughter. I did not hide the fear, nor the shame of having signed without reading. He didn't judge me at any time. As he analyzed the documents, his countenance became serious. He pointed out dates, signatures, clauses that I would never have understood on my own. He said, clearly, that there were strong indications of bad faith, that it was not just emotional abuse, but a thoughtful legal maneuver. Hearing this gave me a mixture of pain and relief. He explained that there were legal ways to reverse the situation, but that it would not be easy. My daughter would probably try to disqualify me, question my lucidity. I felt a chill down my spine. It was exactly what I feared. But this time, I wasn't alone. When he said he would help me, I felt something different inside me. It was not joy. It was dignity returning to the place. I left that office with fear, yes, but also with a plan. And, for the first time since the call from the registry office, I walked with my head held high. On the way home, I observed the city with different eyes. Everything looked the same, but I was no longer the same. I could still lose a lot, but now I knew I wasn't wrong for fighting, and this certainty lit a flame that I thought had already gone out. A few days later, the lawyer called me asking me to return to the office. The tone of his voice was serious, but there was something different there, an urgency mixed with expectation. My stomach turned at the same time. I knew something important had been found. When I arrived, he already had several papers scattered on the table. He asked me to sit down and take a deep breath before continuing. He said that, when investigating old records, he found something that completely changed the scenario. Something that confirmed that the situation was not recent. My heart started beating out of step. He showed an old document, registered many years before, linked to my house. A request for information made in my name, but which I never authorized. The signature was not mine. It was an initial, aborted attempt to tamper with my assets. The date shocked me. That had been done long before, plain paper. My whole body reacted as if I had been hit. It wasn't just betrayal. It was persistence. Someone tried, failed, waited, and tried again, and I never knew. The lawyer explained that that record showed clear intent, something that could weigh heavily in my favor. But, as a mother, it tore me inside. I was silent for long seconds, staring at my own name in a role I didn't recognize. I thought about every Christmas, every birthday, every gesture of affection I gave. All this coexisted with that documentary coldness. The woman I raised had quietly engineered my downfall. He said that ancient record could be the key to proving the premeditated plan, that it was not a mistake, nor a confusion. It was strategy. I listened to everything as if I was far away, trying to accept that the truth was even harsher than I imagined. I left the office feeling a huge weight, but also a strange clarity. The doubt was over. There was no more room for denial. The love I felt did not erase the facts. And the facts were cruel, but, paradoxically, liberators. That day, I walked slowly, as if each step was a farewell to the woman I was. The one who believed that love was enough. The one who thought that children would never cross certain lines. This woman was left behind, along with the naivety that almost cost me everything. If this story is holding you this far, subscribe to the channel now. Every week we bring you strong stories like this, where underrated women turn the tables and prove that it's never too late to get up. When I got home, I sat in the living room in silence. I looked at the walls, at the photos, at the life that was almost taken from me, and instead of crying, I took a deep breath. I was hurt, yes, but now I had something powerful in my hands, the truth. And it was there, facing that hidden past, that I understood that there was no turning back. The fight had really begun, and, even with a heavy heart, I knew I had to go all the way, not only for me, but for the woman I needed to become to survive. After that discovery, I spent days walking around the house like a stranger. Every corner carried memories that now seemed contaminated. I looked at the photos of my daughter as a child and felt a dull pain in my chest. I tried to fit that smiling girl with the cold woman who planned all that. The confusion inside me was almost unbearable. I wondered where I had gone wrong, at what point I failed to see who she was becoming. The guilt came in waves, as if I was responsible for her every choice. But soon after came the revolt, reminding us that character is not taught only with love. That internal struggle consumed me day and night. I started to review old conversations, messages, small gestures that once seemed normal. Now everything took on another meaning. Loose phrases, comments about money, insinuations about my age. The puzzle assembled itself, piece by piece, and the final image was too painful to ignore. The hardest thing was to accept that my daughter wasn't just hurting me without realizing it. She was fighting me. The idea of seeing her as an enemy made me nauseous. I didn't want this role, I didn't want this war. But denying reality was costing me too much. There were nights when I thought about giving up everything, letting her take whatever she wanted just to end that suffering. The fatigue was great, the loneliness even greater. But whenever this idea came up, I remembered her look, cold and calculating, and that made me get up again. I began to understand that love did not mean accepting everything, that being a mother didn't force me to annul myself. This understanding came slowly, painfully, but necessary. I had to choose between living as a victim or facing the truth, no matter how cruel. I started to observe myself with different eyes. I was still there, whole, despite attempts to erase myself. I still had a voice, memory, will. Recognizing this was like reclaiming a piece of me that had been dormant. Fragility no longer defined me completely. Gradually, sadness began to give way to a quiet determination. I didn't scream, I didn't threaten, but I didn't back down either. Inside me, something had lined up. I knew what needed to be done, even if it hurt. Accepting that my daughter had crossed an irreversible line was like living a morning in life. I lost the daughter I thought I had, but I gained clarity. And clarity, at that moment, was a form of strength. When I became aware of this, I felt that something had changed forever. I was still shaking, I was still suffering, but I was no longer paralyzed. The confused woman was falling behind, and the one who appeared in her place was no longer afraid to see who was on the other side. It didn't take long for my daughter to realize that I wasn't so vulnerable anymore. Calls became more frequent, more aggressive. She started talking to me as if I were a disobedient child. Each conversation ended with a veiled threat, disguised as concern. She started to spread the idea that I wasn't in the right head. I commented to relatives and neighbors that I was confused, paranoid. It said I was being influenced by strangers. I felt my name running down the corners of the neighborhood, being distorted little by little. One day, I learned that she had talked to a doctor known to the family, not to take care of myself, but to plant doubts. That gave me a deep fear. The possibility of being considered incapable, of losing my autonomy by force of lying words, took away my sleep. She showed up at home unannounced, with a tense smile on her face. She said she was worried about me, that maybe it would be better for me to rest somewhere else for a while. He spoke of clinics, of rest, of temporary decisions. I listened to it all in silence, feeling the blood boil. When I replied that I had a lawyer, her smile disappeared completely. His eyes darkened, and the mask fell. She accused me of betrayal, said I was destroying the family. The irony almost made me laugh, but I remained steadfast, even with my heart racing. After that, the attacks became more subtle, but more dangerous. Mean comments, strategic visits, attempts to isolate myself. I started to write down everything, every word, every date. The fear still existed, but now it was accompanied by caution. My reputation began to be tested. People who once greeted me with affection began to observe me with suspicion. That hurt, but it also taught me something important. I was paying the price of facing someone who didn't play fair. Even so, I didn't back down. Each attack reinforced my certainty that I was on the right track. If she needed to lie to weaken me, it was because the truth was on my side. And that sustained me when loneliness tightened. I talked to the lawyer about everything that was happening. He told me to stay calm, to document every attempt at intimidation. She said that this behavior could turn against her. Hearing this gave me a little breath. War was now declared, even if silent. I knew the final confrontation was approaching, and although fear was still present, it no longer overwhelmed me. I was more prepared than she imagined. At that stage, I realized that I was no longer the same woman as at the beginning. The victim was learning to defend himself. And, even though I was hurt, I began to understand that surviving was also an act of courage. The days leading up to the hearing were the longest of my life. Each morning seemed to carry the weight of a definitive decision. I woke up early, organized the papers, reread notes, tried to keep my mind steady. Fear still appeared, but it no longer paralyzed me as before. Now he kept me on my toes. The lawyer calmly explained to me how everything would work. He talked about difficult questions, about attempts to destabilize me. I said that my stance would be as important as the documents. I listened intently, knowing that for the first time, my word would have to face my daughter's word in front of strangers. I started to rehearse answers alone, sitting in the living room, looking at the wall. I trained not to cry, not to lower my head, not to apologize for existing. It was strange to have to learn this so late in life, but I was learning. Each rehearsal was a step out of the role of victim. My daughter tried to call me on the eve of the hearing. I didn't answer. The simple vibration of the phone already caused a tightness in my stomach. I knew that any conversation could become a weapon against me. Silence, this time, was a conscious choice, not a sign of weakness. That night, I hardly slept. I kept remembering everything I lived, everything I built. I thought about how hard I worked, how much I gave in, how much I trusted. And I also thought about how underestimated I was. That gave me an unexpected calm. I wasn't asking for anything other than what had always been mine. The next morning, I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to respect me. I chose a simple, clean, firm outfit, as I wanted to look inside. When I looked in the mirror, I saw wrinkles, I saw tiredness, but I also saw someone who would no longer hide. The path to the forum was silent. The lawyer drove, and I watched the city pass by the window. People going to work, children going to school, life going on. I thought about how, for the world, this was just another day. For me, it was everything. As I entered the building, I felt my legs weaken for a second. I took a deep breath and held tight to the briefcase with the documents. That folder did not only carry papers. It carried my story, my truth, my last line of defense. I saw my daughter across the hall. She avoided my gaze. For the first time, she seemed insecure. That gave me a silent strength, not for pleasure, but for confirmation. Those who need to lie always fear the moment when the truth comes out. When we were called, I got up slowly, feeling my heart beating strongly. But I took the first step without hesitation. I was there, present, lucid, ready to face everything that came, and that, in itself, was already a victory. The courtroom was cold, overlit, with no room for emotions. I sat upright, with my hands resting on my lap, trying to control my breathing. The judge spoke, the lawyers took a stand, and everything started to move too fast. Still, I paid attention to every word. When my daughter spoke, I heard a version of me that I almost didn't recognize. A confused, fragile woman, unable to decide. Her every sentence was calculated to diminish me. That hurt, but it didn't surprise me. It was exactly what she had been trying to do outside. When it was my turn, I felt a heavy silence settle in. My voice came out firm, more than I expected. I told him what happened, the way it happened. I spoke of trust, of the paper presented as simple, of the connection of the notary. I didn't exaggerate, I didn't dramatize. He just told the truth. The documents began to be presented. Dates, records, signatures. The old record came to light, and I saw my daughter's countenance change. For the first time, she seemed lost. Her narrative was beginning to crack before everyone. The judge asked direct questions, and I answered clearly. I didn't have to pretend anything. I knew who I was, I knew what I had experienced. Each answer reinforced something simple. I was there out of awareness, not confusion. And that made all the difference. When her lawyer tried to destabilize me, insinuating that I didn't remember things well, I took a deep breath and kept my gaze steady. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just stood by my truth. That was more powerful than any scream. The tension in the room was palpable. People whispered, eyes crossed. I felt the weight of the moment, but I also felt something new. A quiet respect was beginning to emerge. Not out of pity, but out of consistency. At the end of the hearing, there was still no final decision. But something had already changed. The image they tried to build about me was broken. I was not a lost lady. I was a woman who knew exactly what I was doing. I left the room with my heart racing, but with my head held high. My daughter passed me without saying anything. There was no direct confrontation, no harsh words. It was not necessary. The game had turned there, in front of everyone. Outside, I took a deep breath, feeling the air come in as if it were the first time. I didn't know exactly how it would all end, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never again be treated as someone disposable. The truth had been told, and no one else could erase that. In the days following the hearing, my daughter's silence was louder than any scream. No call, no message, no attempt to contact them. It was as if she had disappeared from the map, withdrawn to her own shame. For the first time, I was the one who didn't have to explain myself to anyone. The lawyer called me a few days later to say that the judge had analyzed the documents carefully. The attempt to disqualify me as incapable had not been sustained. My daughter's contradictions were too evident to ignore. Hearing this, I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling a huge weight leave my chest. The news began to spread, just as the rumors had spread before. Neighbors who had avoided my gaze now came to start a conversation. Some apologized in disguise, others just smiled respectfully. I didn't take pleasure in it. I felt only a deep tiredness, mixed with relief. My daughter tried, through third parties, to justify her attitudes. He said that it had all been a misunderstanding, that he just wanted to protect me, but the words no longer had force. The mask had fallen, and I knew exactly what was behind it. I didn't have to answer. When the provisional decision came out, guaranteeing that I would remain in my house until the final judgment, I sat in the living room and cried alone. It was not a cry of victory, it was a cry of liberation. The house breathed with me again. The walls felt less cramped, as if acknowledging that I still owned my space. I started to walk around the house with a different posture, not because everything was solved, but because I had recovered something essential: my voice, my presence, my right to exist without asking permission. Every step was a silent affirmation. In a brief and inevitable encounter, I crossed paths with my daughter in the corridor of the forum. She looked at me quickly, without holding her gaze. I didn't say anything, not out of weakness, but because there was nothing more to say. The real confrontation had already happened. I realized that the biggest unmasking had not been public, it had been internal. I stopped seeing myself as someone easily disposable. That change no one could take away from me, neither judges, nor papers, nor blood ties. During that period, I began to reorganize my practical life. I updated documents, changed passwords, put everything in order. Every small action was a gesture of belated but necessary self-care. I was learning to protect myself. Even with the pain still present, I felt something new taking hold, a kind of self-respect that I had never exercised before. The betrayal had wounded me deeply, but it had also woken me up, and that changed everything. By the end of that chapter of my life, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, but for the first time, it didn't scare me, because the woman who emerged from that fall was no longer fragile. She was conscious. And that was strength. As the weeks passed, the dust began to settle, but the marks remained. The relationship with my daughter was not rebuilt, and I no longer fed this illusion. Some wounds were not made to heal completely. They serve to remind you where not to touch again. The process was still taking its course, but I had already learned to live without waiting for external decisions to validate me. Each day in peace inside my house was a silent conquest. I allowed myself to create new routines, more my own, less shaped by the expectations of others. I started to frequent the neighborhood more, to talk without fear. The shame they tried to put on me no longer stuck. I knew who I was. And this was reflected in the way I walked, talked, occupied space. People feel it when someone stops diminishing themselves. There were nights when the sadness returned, especially when I thought about what I lost emotionally. It was no small feat. I lost the daughter I thought I had. I lost the idea of a safe family. But I gained something I had never really had: full autonomy over myself. I started planning small projects. Nothing grandiose, just things that gave me pleasure. Organize the house in my own way, take care of the garden, think about short trips. Rebuilding is not building a new castle. Sometimes it's just clearing the rubble calmly. My daughter tried a timid, indirect approach months later. There was no apology, just an awkward silence. I listened, I responded politely, but I kept my distance. Some bridges should not be crossed again without solid foundations. And in that case, they didn't exist. I learned that winning does not mean coming out unscathed. It means leaving in one piece. Even with scars. Even with losses. I was no longer the woman who signed a paper without reading it. I was someone who knew how to ask, demand, protect. The story they told about me didn't win. The truth, even belated, found room to breathe. And I learned that dignity is not negotiable, not even in the name of love. Today, when I sit on the balcony and look out over the street, I feel something different from the silence of before. It is not empty. It is conscious peace. The peace of those who survived a profound betrayal and still chose to continue. I know my ending is not fairy tale. There is no perfect reconciliation, no family reunited. But there is something rarer: regained self-respect. And that, for me, is worth more than any inheritance. Today, when I think about everything I experienced, it seems that I am remembering someone else's life. That woman who signed a paper without reading it still exists in me, but she doesn't rule anymore. She was hurt, deceived, underestimated. But it was also she who opened her eyes at the most difficult moment, and I honor that part of my story. I learned that fragility is not synonymous with weakness. I was fragile when I trusted, but I was strong when I faced it. The difference is in not remaining on the ground after the fall. Each tear I shed watered a new, firmer, more alert consciousness. I have not only lost illusions, I gained lucidity. My home is back to my home, not only on paper, but in feeling. I walk through each room knowing that I belong there. Not because a judge said so, but because I fought. This security no longer comes from other people's promises, it comes from me. And that changes everything. I don't hate my daughter, but I don't make excuses either. The love I feel now is different, more distant, more cautious. There are things that are not rebuilt the way they were, and accepting this was one of the greatest tests of maturity I have ever faced. I started to be more attentive to my decisions, my words, my limits. Not out of fear, but out of self-respect. I discovered that aging does not mean disappearing. It often means stopping pleasing to finally exist. And this freedom is powerful. Some people see me as an ordinary lady, others know what I faced. But the truth is that I no longer need to be seen to validate myself. I know who I am, and that's enough. My story is not one of revenge, it is one of conscious survival. There are quiet days and difficult days, as in any real life. The difference is that now I don't shrink from conflict. I don't lower my eyes anymore out of habit. I learn to hold my space calmly and firmly. This is something that no one else can take away from me. If someone asked me what I lost, I would say, I lost naivety, I lost an idealized version of family. But if they asked me what I earned, I would answer without hesitation, I earned myself. I gained a voice, presence, decision. I gained steel where before there was only silence. My story does not end with applause, nor with collective hugs. It ends with something rarer. It ends with me sitting on the porch, taking a deep breath, knowing that I survived without destroying myself, that I faced betrayal without becoming bitter. I'm no longer the woman who signed without reading. I am the woman who has read her own life carefully, even when it hurt. And I move forward like this, with my head held high, firm steps, my heart attentive. Not perfect, not immune, but strong, woman of steel. If this story touched you in any way, leave a comment below. Many people go through silent betrayals within their own family and think they are alone. Your comment can be an outburst, a support, or even a warning to those who have not yet realized what they are experiencing. Here, each story is a voice, and yours matters too.